the discussion. Thank you. So, good afternoon and welcome to everyone who's joined this roundtable discussion on philanthropic support to universities in South Africa. The Annual Survey of Philanthropy in Higher Education that we call ASPIHE was initiated in 2014 and is made possible through a grant we received from the Kresge Foundation. Kresge funding for the survey ended in 2017, and the survey is currently funded by university subscriptions. There are currently 11 universities that participate in ASPIHE. The ASPIHE report has been a valuable report because it provides a rigorous and in-depth overview of philanthropic support to universities in South Africa. It showcases the very important role of the advancement officers in the universities we've surveyed, and it showcases their role in the administration and management of philanthropic support. It also demonstrates the commitment of global and South African philanthropy to the South African university sector. Data management, prospecting, cultivation, stewardship are all important elements of resource mobilization. And the performance of advancement officers in the survey demonstrates a high standard of professional competence and being on par with and sometimes surpassing global counterparts. So while the report showcases the important role of advancement officers, it is also pointed to an uneven development paradigm when it comes to universities in South Africa. And this, we believe, needs a reflective conversation. And the roundtable that we're at today is intended to start that conversation. So in essence, the overall aim of today's presentation and the roundtable discussion is to provide general reflections on some of the patterns that have emerged in the ASPIHE research. And our primary intention is to trigger discussion on the implications for the university system. We are interested in collaborative strategies that seek to build the whole university system and identifying the mechanisms, guidelines, and even policy directives that will assist universities in optimizing third stream income revenue. And so I think it's the beginning of a very, very important conversation as we think about the university system holistically. And we've invited some key participants to this conversation. And I'm very pleased to say that we have, as a facilitator, a friend of Inyathelo and a great supporter of advancement in South Africa. In fact, it's through the Kresge Foundation that a lot of this work was begun, and also through the leadership role that Bill Moses in particular, our current facilitator for this roundtable, has played. So Bill has served as a managing director of the Kresge Foundation's education program. And it's not only in the advancement sector that Kresge has made a difference in South Africa. All of us who have been, had engagement with Kresge, and particularly at the national level, know the contribution that Kresge has also made to student equity and dealing with specific equity concerns in higher education. Bill's enormous contribution to the field was recognized by President Biden in the US, and Bill's been appointed to the Advisory Committee on Historically Black Universities and HBCUs, Historically Black Universities and Community Colleges in the US. There's so much I could say about him, but I won't, because we would rather get into the conversation. We will post the CVs of all participants and especially our panelists on our Inyathelo web platform. But the other person who I have pleasure in introducing here is Beverly Thaver, who is a professor in higher education studies at UWC. She has 3 decades of higher education experience, teaching, research, supervision, and has served on several senior committees, including 2 ministerial appointees. She's been 2 terms as a ministerial appointee to the Council on Higher Education. She has done extensive research, and I'm not going to go into those details, but she is a real star, and we are very, very pleased to have her take over the ASPIHE research for Inyathelo. The other panelists, we have 2 prestigious scientists, Professor Moyo, who has a PhD in mathematics from the University of Natal, Durban, UKZN. She's currently serving as a Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research, Innovation and Engagement in the Durban University of Technology, and is responsible for research and innovation policy development, implementation and evaluation. She has published extensively globally and locally, and has recently received an award for her innovative contributions to the field of entrepreneurialism. She is such a star to have among us. Professor Bawa is a theoretical physicist, but we also know him as a Vice Chancellor and the Executive Director of USAF. He really needs no introduction. He has played such a substantive and innovative role in the sector. Sarah Rennie, so proud to have you also, Sarah, as the Chair of the Independent Philanthropy Association of South Africa. Sarah is an expert in philanthropy and corporate social investment with special interest in education. She is the chair of the Grandrod Family Centenary Trust, non-executive director of the Standard Bank Tutua Community Foundation, trustee of Liberty Community Trust, trustee of the Epoch and Optima Trusts, and the Anglo-American Namibia Foundation. She also sits on a number of non-profit boards and has practiced law in London for many years. And on her return, she worked at Chikululu, the social investments, as the chief operating officer. Sarah has extensive experience in the philanthropic sector, and it is such a pleasure to have her. And last but not least is our chair, the chair of the Inyathelo board, Dr. Russell Ali, who has a doctorate from the University of Cambridge in Great Britain. He has substantive experience in donor and alumni relations, fundraising, and philanthropy. He currently, as I said, serves as the chair of our board of trustees. He is the senior director, institutional advancement at the UFS, University of the Free State. And before that, he had, I think, over 6 years at the department as executive director of the development and alumni department at the University of Cape Town. He was responsible for institutional advancement, fundraising, and alumni relations. He has worked in the philanthropy sector, program officer at Ford, and as the country representative for the Mott Foundation. And besides that, Russell has an extensive history in working on human rights in our country. He has also served on a global with the United Nations, and he has served as a commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We have an esteemed panel, and Bill, I'm going to pass over to you now. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Nazima, and thank you for those kind words. What I'd like to do is really turn this over to Beverly to really give her summation and reflections on the 2020 ASPIHE report, and to sort of catch us up on what the latest survey has shown about philanthropic giving at South African higher education. So go ahead, Beverly, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Let me just start off by thanking Inyathelo and to thank Russell. We're going to go on first names, and Nazima, Jocelyn, and the team at Inyathelo. And Bill, thank you for moderating today. The second point is, you know, that this research was done with Dr. Mark Abrams and Dr. Daniel Adeniyi, the statistician. Today's presentation is really a kind of, I'm really only looking at general patterns that have emerged from the research. So, and then I will give some kind of reflections on what I think might be implications for the discussion. So Jocelyn, you want to start off? Okay, so I have about 6 or 7 slides that gives you a kind of glimpse into the survey. The aim of the survey was to glean quantitative data for third stream income, a segment of third stream income, which is philanthropy, for 10 institutions, and that was done for 2019. The methods that we used were mainly descriptive statistical methods. We used the very same instrument that has been used over, I think, about 8 to 10 years, if I'm correct. The key point about the actual survey that I'd like to make and to start off with is that it's about the shape and size of these 10 institutions, right? Each of which occupy very different institutional positions in the higher education landscape. And here we, looking at legacy identities that are quite important. But I will come back to that later. Next one, thank you. So in terms of the total income, right, and the donors that have contributed to the system, you will notice that we used the benchmark of 2013. Okay, now in terms of the total income, you will see there that there's 659 million, right? And that increases quite substantially to 1.5 billion in 2019. Now that constitutes kind of traditional philanthropy income. But if we include what is called the Sector Education Training Authority income, then that takes us up to 1.94 billion. Okay, so there's about, 400 million as an increase. And I will come back to that later when I give some of my brief comments. So that's income in terms of the kind of rands and cents. The donors, you will notice that actually triples over time to 12,554, and then if you include what I will refer to as CETA income, it goes up to 12,643. Now let's look at the income in terms of geographic source. In 2013, you'll notice that the income is on 53% nationally. And when you compare that to 2019, then the national income, right, the source goes up to 69. And international, you'll notice, declines, right, in 2019. So that's rands and cents. Sorry, can we just stay on that one quickly, Jocelyn? And then the donors, you will notice that the national in 2013 is 87%, right? And that increases in 2019 to 90%. So that's really the geographical distribution, national versus international. Okay, let's go. Thank you. So let's now look at the income, right, by philanthropic sector. And the two kind of key stats here is 39% and 38%. And the 39%, right, for 2019 constitutes money from trusts and foundations. Now, if you glance across, you'll notice that that is actually on 61%. So we see a pattern here that there's a decline in trusts and foundations, right? And then if you look at the 38%, it's private sector, you will notice there that there's an increase from 2013. So I think that's quite an important kind of pattern that we might want to unpack. Next one. So now, so we've looked at the rands and cents. So let's just look at the donors. And here you will see that the individuals in terms of donor type is very high. Now, I just want to alert you to the fact that the number of individuals does not necessarily translate into the size of the grants. Just in case you're wondering, because the size of the grants, the higher proportion is coming from trusts and foundations. But we also need to look at what constitutes individuals in terms of a philanthropic type, and I'll come back to that later. Next one. Then we've got, sorry, I just put my timer on. So where then is the funding? We've got, all this funding coming in. So where's the funding actually directed? Now it's quite clear here, the funding is directed to students with 49%. And in teaching and learning, 17. And in the remaining kind of infrastructure, research, community engagement, other initiatives, they trail behind. So the key one here is student funding. The philanthropy is following students in certain institutions. Okay, let's move. So I now want to just give you quickly the approximate value of the largest single donation per university in 2019. And I think this is two important figures for us just to hold. The lowest one is 3.1 and the highest is 49. So there's a huge there's a huge difference, right, in this figure, and we want to come back to that later. Okay. Now that kind of unevenness, right, is graphically represented in this pie chart, which tells us that 96% is going to what the report defines as traditional universities. That's where 96% of that figure of 1.5 is actually going. So it's fairly skewed. So that's philanthropy. Let me just give you insight into the CETA income, right, in terms of university type. And you will notice there that the so-called non-traditional universities tend to garner quite a bit of CETA income, although it is not entirely at the exclusion of what is defined as traditional. But I will come back to that later. Okay. Next one. So having given you a kind of, an overall picture of some of the key patterns, I want to now move in to the key points. Okay. And could you put the other key points up as well? Okay, so the total, as I've said, is 1.5, and it's 1.9 if we include CETA. So let me just look at the shape and the size of philanthropy, right, and make some points there. Well, the first is that the number of donors have increased. And I think that it's with much kind of gratitude, that I have to say that that our country is really graciously, we accept the giving on the part of donors, both nationally and internationally. We also noticed that there's a very strong giving component at our national level. And I think that this kind of points to a sense of civic responsibility on the part of selected organizations and institutions and individuals. And I think that this kindness has to be recognized and acknowledged. That the private sector its giving is increasing, And that means that the private sector is recognizing the need for intellectual development, and that our society needs to develop our intellectual thinking base in order to grow our economy, our society, and our humanity. Individual donors are also increasing. It also tends to be quite high. We're not quite sure whether the individual donors is ahead or whether an individual donor is an organization. So that is around the, how we unpack philanthropy. And it also states that the fees must fall movement, right? In a sense, the crisis has provided an opportunity for giving. And I think that, in any crisis, there's always a window of opportunity. And we are busy seeing this in terms of the kind of, there are signals around civic responsibility, around, the need for us to develop our base. Then the data also shows that approximately, well, it was 49, I've put down 50% of the total support is actually going to student funding. So the philanthropy is moving in the direction of where the students are in certain universities. Now we'll come back to that right at the end. Then, unfortunately, we've noticed that the trusts and foundations as a source declines over time. And I think this might signal kind of global developments, So I think we might want to think of it not only in terms of what it means for South Africa, but I think we want to think of it globally, because there's a lot of kind of vectors of change, vectors of crisis that are happening. And I think that is also contributing to where it is donors want to invest their resources. Then I think the third very important point I want to make is that the CETA income is very high among non-traditional, so-called non-traditional institutions. And I want to make 2 points around this. I think the first point that I want to make is that the CETA, to generate CETA income is it's a high labor-intensive process. So the fact that our institutions are able to tap into the source means that they are actually investing quite a bit of labor, person power into sourcing funds from the sector. And then the second point I want to make is that, which I think is very important and quite interesting, is that the CETA funding is targeting very innovative, socially responsive programs in the system. So, for example, you would have food insecurity, right, which is quite important. You would have the hospitality industry in terms of how do you develop new qualifications for manufacturing food, etc. There are several other examples, but the key point I want to make is that it is a kind of mechanism whereby the advancement officers are using to source income that can be innovative for our system. I will now move towards some general pointers, okay, as a way forward. So the first point I want to make is that I think that the overall aim and purpose of the survey, we might want to re-look at it. because I'm wondering whether there isn't a constraint in terms of using comparison, right, or comparative as a method. You know, do you compare apples with apples, or do you compare, you know, apples with pears? So the method of comparison, you know, we might want to unpack that. And is it the most, and what is the most effective way to include all 26 institutions? So that's the first point. The second point I'd like to make is that having participated, you know, and kind of gone through the data in the survey, I noticed that the terminology could be sharpened and possibly aligned, especially in terms of the national system. Now, what I really mean by that is that you've got we've got an official system, right, in which the kind of legacy has the kind of racialization that the legacy has bequeathed, that the system tried to kind of cut through that racial differentiation, right, with a merger process. And in cutting through that, it developed institutional types, such as universities, universities of technology, and comprehensive. It also combined what were originally historically advantaged with historically disadvantaged. So you have legacy identities that are sitting in one institution. So the question, so when philanthropy is trying to look where to invest their resources, right? There's a sense in which the one is looking at that the terms such as historically disadvantaged, historically white, historically advantaged, historic traditional, is not integrated into the official system. And so I think that we want to avoid kind of a parallel system operating. So that is around the terminology and the way in which the legacy identities are nesting. Then the philanthropy types need to be clarified. I think what's emerged is that you know, what's the distinction between well, a trust and a foundation is quite easy, and you could identify that nationally and or internationally, because it's more it proliferates internationally and nationally. But in terms of, for example, private sector, you know, what is a private sector? What is an individual donor? You know, so I think that we might want to look at unpacking, is an individual only, you know, a head, or is it is an individual donor a private organization? So that was around philanthropic types. Now, I'd like to get to the last two kind of complex pointers as a way forward. I think the first point is that where is the higher education system heading, you know, in terms of structures of inequality, and what are policy implications of the philanthropic trends? So, you know, if it's so skewed in the sense that you're getting 96% of philanthropy is only going to certain institutions, you know, are there kind of policy implications around that? Is it that the because the institutions that are not being targeted, right, have what you call double and triple whammies, for want of a better word, in the sense that the constituency is not a highly resourced constituency, so it doesn't have the benefit of an endowment. And then, you know, the way in which the system operates means that it doesn't always get the kind of the benefits of the system in terms of subsidy. So then there might be institutional dynamics that contribute to reputational that might, you know, to reputational kind of risks, and there's not a kind of parity of esteem in terms of institutions. So we know that we are sitting with a legacy, we are sitting with complexity, right? We are sitting with gratitude and kindness on the part of institutions, on the part of individuals, on the part of government, on the part of global philanthropy. And that the advancement officers are doing in all the institutions extensive work in order to generate income. Now, is there a window of opportunity, right? In other words, can there be a kind of national coordinated strategy, a platform for partnerships, right, in which, you know, the science and innovation strategy can actually catch all of the institutional types? Because each institution adds to the intellectual and skills value of the nation. And so I want to end off on 4 points around this window of opportunity. Okay? And the first point I want to make is that we clearly have to distinguish between what are institutional dynamics, right? What's happening inside institutions, right? And what are the kind of commitments and obligations on the part of the state or the government. Now, in terms of government, I want to just mention that the quality assurance of all programs in all 26 institutions have been rigorously assessed and rigorously assured. And so they all have been subject to a process that gives them accreditation. So I want to just, you know, send that signal out that it's that the quality assurance of our programs are fairly rigorous. Okay. The second point I want to make around this window of opportunity is to talk about, just to mention something about our everyday life. Because all the students are coming from different institutional types, right? But they all are making a difference, right, in our society. And I think we just want to, for the moment, think of our healthcare workers. Our healthcare workers have given us life, okay? They've helped us to live. Where do they come from? Our judiciary is under enormous pressure at the moment because the language of English, which predominates, you know, the language is linked to access. So there's interpreters, there's translators, right? Where do they come from? We've got 11 official languages. Then there's technology. Our youth, our vibrant youth, are so alert to technology that, you know, we need to garner this energy that is operating among all our youth, regardless of where they come from. And I do know that the question would be raised about well, graduate employability, graduate non-employability, etc. And on that point, the market, you know, isn't neutral. You know, it also has its preferred kind of ways of operating. And so I think that the window of opportunity is really to work on the principle that all our institutions matter, that all our students matter, and that there is an opportunity now to have a platform with government, with institutions, with business, and the kind of corporate social investment that we now see, you know, is really making a difference. And philanthropy, if all can come onto a platform, we can then create a coordinated strategy that can only but enhance the work that philanthropy is doing so well in terms of resourcing, so that all students can, you know, dynamically live and contribute not only to South Africa, but globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Thaver. That was really terrific and just wonderful to hear. If you have questions about the survey and you would like them to be answered, what would be great is for everyone listening in to go ahead and put things in the chat. And then what we'll do is at about 16:30, we'll pull up these questions and let Dr. Thaver answer them if there are sort of points of information. I know there were one or two pretty minor things I was going to ask her about, just technical things to clarify. So we'll do that at about 4:30. But now what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about, first I want to thank Inyathelo, especially Nazima Mohammed, for bringing us together, Beverly for writing the ASPIHE report, all the universities that participated in the research, and of course, all of you for joining us today. Just by way of some long-term background, you know, the Kresge Foundation has supported advancement in South Africa for about 20 years. And we first made a challenge grant of $1.5 million to UCT to help build the Upper Campus Library. The campaign was successful. UCT raised $4 million or something, and we gave them $1.5 million to really build that library. And Mampila Rampele established herself as the best VC fundraiser in the country and proved that UCT could raise money like North American institutions. Nevertheless, despite the success, the UCT insiders that we spoke to said they nearly missed the mark. They had no advancement capacity and structure at that time, no real history of organized and professionalized advancement. They'd gotten a grant from Atlantic Philanthropies to support private fundraising, but with no technical assistance or support. UCT succeeded by sheer will, and frankly, by reading books they purchased overseas on how to raise money. So after we had paid off the grant, I brought Kresge's then president to South Africa and met with a group of about 5 to 10 VCs. This is before all the significant mergers occurred. So the higher education sector was about twice as large in terms of institutions at that time. And the conclusion of one observer in the room was that if UCT could barely raise this money with all of its privilege and resources, none of the rest of the VCs in the room had a chance. And from that observation by Sheila Gastro, Inyathelo was born. In turn, we had an initiative in 2006, the first special initiative in South Africa on advancement. And we excluded all the universities that got support from that original Atlantic money. So that was UCT, WITS, Rhodes, and UKZN. And we based our program in South Africa on our work with historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. Our goal at the time was to see and ideally prove that with the right support and incentives, South African universities could raise significant private funds for research, capital projects, bursaries, and everything that a major modern university needs to maintain the margin of excellence. After a competitive process, with all the other members of the South African higher education system eligible to apply, We selected UWC, CPUT, Pretoria, and the Red Cross Children's Hospital Trust. Vitz's Luiso was disappointed he couldn't be part of it because he was not part of the Atlantic money, although the university was. And so he asked if he could just sort of participate without any grant funding. After a year, they were doing so well, we invited them to join the program with grant support. The bottom line was the results were spectacular. UWC, which only raised about $200,000 in the year we started, was which is about 3 million Rand, eventually was raising millions of dollars, and in fact had the single best year of any institution in the program, led really by the visionary leadership and charismatic leadership by Brian O'Connell. All in all, the fundraising increased by at least 3 times. We think probably more than that for a variety of technical reasons. And so Brian, Luiso, and Viswa Tenga and Cheryl DeLoray, the VCs, all proved that it was possible to raise private funds strategically, professionally, ethically, and effectively. And indeed, when we asked in 2011, what should we do next? The overwhelming support was for student success and for a continuation of the advancement work. And so we added a second cohort, ended up being UFS, TUT, DUT, and UJ, and they had similar results. Of course, one of the legacies was this, in fact, this ASPIHE report. And as we look back at this ASPIHE report and what Beverly just said, we know that South African institutions can raise private money from foundations, CEDAs, corporations, individuals. And again, 20 years ago, that was not really established common understanding. It was just not, if UCT was having trouble doing it, it was probably not happening at very many places at all. And so, you know, what we've seen too is this shift from focusing on international donors and international foundations, of which we are one, to domestic donors, which to me is particularly gratifying in terms of civil society, support for institutions, and the critical local philanthropic support for your own real national crown jewels, your amazing universities. But while we know that research universities, comprehensive universities, University of Technology, and historically disadvantaged institutions have all flourished with the right support in advancement, ASPIHE suggests that research universities are still dominating fundraising from philanthropy. And so we're going to hear from several colleagues, and they're going to talk about their perspective on what the ASPIHE report has shown and where we might go from here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with Sarah Rennie, the chair of APASA. Sarah, take it away.
Thanks very much, Bill. And thank you to Nazima for the kind invitation, and Beverly and everybody that's been involved in this really excellent and insightful report. I think so often we don't get enough comprehensive research on institutions of higher education, and how the trends have developed over time. So this is a very valuable addition to really understanding what's going on in the sector. So just a couple of disclaimers. I am not in any of my positions really significantly involved in funding universities. So my knowledge is gleaned from my peers and colleagues in the independent philanthropy sector. And I'm very grateful that APASA has allowed us to really build these relationships so that I can call upon a number of people that I know have got way deeper and wider and longer experience in funding universities than I could ever claim to have. And I certainly, before this panel, did canvass a number of my colleagues that represent very significant private philanthropic, funds and trusts and foundations and other individual donors into the higher education sector. So a lot of what I'm saying is a summary of the conversations and the insights that I was able to garner. In terms of the standout pattern for me And basically, I've kind of got three sections to what I'd like to say. One is just really to make an observation of a pattern that I think is very important. And then the other two sections is really to look at some of the constraints that I've learned about in terms of donors' perceptions of funding into universities, and then more importantly, the opportunities, and then multiple. So I hope I get to that. You know, the key standout pattern that I've observed in the conversations and through the report is that local donors fund students. We saw that was around 50% in the report, and arguably you could even consider the research element, which was, I think, at about 13% in terms of doctorate research at the doctorate level and PhD level. So that is the very dominant theme. And why that is, I think, could be the subject of another very interesting piece of research. But I think to guess at it, it's probably that there is a strong belief in many donors in the opportunities and the power of the individual, the belief in the concept of paying it forward. I think a number of donors, Alan Gray, for example, was the recipient of a scholarship, and that allowed his personal journey to form a completely different trajectory. And this is often the case, and I think donors see how individual lives can be completely transformed, and families and communities as a result of sponsoring students. So local donors follow, this is the second key idea, and perhaps maybe I'm at odds with the report here, and this would be a great point of engagement and debate. But what I understood from my conversations is that local donors tend to follow the students' preference for universities. This was consistent across all the donors that I spoke to. And following from that, it was absolutely clear that students, this is a kind of direct quote, overwhelmingly want to go to UCT. So, and then they want to go to the other top 6 universities. So when donors are selecting scholarship candidates, these students are being very clear about their preference for where they want to study, and the donors are tending to follow that. And I think that this may be a key insight as to some of the, that 96% of funding into historically advantaged or traditional universities, whatever you want to call them, the UCT and the other top 6 universities, as they're called. I don't even know what those top 6 universities are, but that's the local language amongst these scholarship donors. So the model tends to be scholarships with criteria of a needs assessment and academic performance. And there is a strong commitment with all the donors that I spoke to fund disadvantaged Black students. Many donors work hard to find these students, particularly at a postgraduate level. Obviously, at an undergraduate level, this is not a difficulty, but at a postgraduate level, this is a difficulty. Many donors speak about NSFAS funding and other constraints to funding undergraduates. So, for example, one donor, the trust deed, insists that the funds go only to postgraduates. And they fund masters, PhD students, and postdoctoral students. So the students in that category, the postgrad postgrad students, tend to look for research universities. And again, this is a narrowing or a focus that skews the funding. And if these students publish, then my understanding is that is a huge spin-off for the university, because you get research subsidies per journal article, and those research subsidies are quite significant. And so if you're a teaching-only university, or a university where there's not high rates of publishing, you're unable to access some of this funding. So again, understanding these patterns, I heard in a very articulate way some of the local funders really forefronting the crisis of youth unemployment. With youth unemployment at a rate of 65%, employability becomes a key criteria for success in understanding the whole program in terms of funding scholarships. So the funders and the students know that big corporates tend to recruit from what they understand as the top 6 universities. And so students know this and their donors know this. And so from a funder and a student perspective, the return on their investment that they're looking for is a degree and a job. And I think this framework of understanding is really what is driving a lot of the funding decision making. So that's really just a general kind of comment on some of these patterns and this huge forefronting really the student and the student preferences, especially at a postgraduate level, and how that is affecting selection of universities. The constraints really that came up in these conversations was that in South Africa, we do have a situation where most post-matriculants want to go to university. That is a preference for a number of reasons, and I'm sure there's a lot of good research on as to why. But again, especially to prestigious universities that they are aware of, such as UCT, UJ, Wits, etc., etc. So the question then is really, how do we make the rest of the tertiary system, the TVET colleges, the other colleges where we would actually like the bulk of our postgraduate students to attend? I know that the NDP targets TVET enrollment as being, the highest levels of enrollment, and then university educations, and then the CET college enrollments. So how do we start to really make the TVETs and CET colleges, more attractive to students? And there was a very interesting anecdote that came through for me, and this is certainly not research, it's anecdotal, but that a number in the Afrikaans community, a number of postmatrics are choosing the TVETs and trades because they believe that this gives them an opportunity to be entrepreneurial, to work for themselves. And so the TVET and trade colleges hold no stigma to that community in terms of tertiary education. And they know that they can make a good living from being a plumber or electrician. But my understanding is that for many students coming out of school, the aspiration is a university education. And I think that more work needs to be done in that regard. Another area which is critical and really looked at very carefully from a donor perspective is student failure. So statistics around throughputs and dropout rates in terms of the scholarships that they have on their books. They know that this is psychologically devastating for students, and it's expensive for them as the funder. So funders really would go a long way to try and avoid student failure and student dropout. And it's a constraint, but I think it's also an opportunity. And then one of the more general, comments was, and I think this is part of the work of strengthening advancement officers and that section of the universities, is that there tends to be a lack of proactive engagement often with funders to really understand the funder strategy as well as the university needs. And we can talk more about that if it's an area that we can explore further. What I found really encouraging was that the donors I spoke to that know the sector really well have identified many opportunities, I mean, over and above what they're already doing in terms of funding. One area which was spoken about a lot is to really invite universities to focus on centers of excellence that would be compelling to a donor. And again, and particularly Bill, given your earlier comment about unencumbered giving, this is in contradiction perhaps to a view of giving broad, unrestricted funding. This is actually much more specific and focused, a much more specific and focused funding approach. And what they're saying is that actually universities that engaged with a donor around a specific proposition to show how that university intends to become a leader in a specialized field that will be significant or uniquely different, something specific and unique that university can be recognized for. So rather than a broad donation to a whole university, hone in on real centers of excellence and opportunities. And this would, the criteria, I think, in terms of what is significance would be obviously looking to build excellence in a particular area. And also, again, and it's interesting that this has come through in some of the research, how is it relevant for the community, for the local community? And I want to go straight on to a couple of examples that were given to me, quite a few, in fact. The bilingual B.Ed program that Fort Hare is developing was noted as one of these potential centers of excellence that can reshape the education system. WITS's approach to interdisciplinary research was another example that was given to me. The health sciences in KZN that has done such remarkable work through the COVID period and through other, transmissible pandemics. Another great idea that was given was to say, for example, if you look at Sol Plaatje building a program around servicing the SKA and what that would mean, that, the development of big data skills and other related scientists for the SKA in the Northern Cape. The University of Pretoria's very specific program around localizing the link between university and schools in a hyperlocal way. So there were actually a number of really great examples of the Center of Excellence idea. The other opportunity consistently appears to be honors degrees. These seem to be very underfunded. They are considered to be a low-risk opportunity because these are already graduates, and they have a very high return on investment because the employability of an honors graduate skyrockets in comparison to a three-year graduate. Another opportunity would be to engage with funders to split the first year over 2 years to reduce dropout rates, or to support a bridging year. So, and then finally, actually linking to with, what Kreski has been doing is really this opportunity for data and a closer feedback loops between funders that are funding students and the university, so that there is an earlier recognition and detection of at-risk students, and that funders can step in much earlier, like around March, to start putting in place support structures for students that are not looking promising in terms of passing their exams. So, I think the funders are really excited about the opportunities and very committed to supporting in niche areas. And I'm going to close there, Bill. I'm sure there'll be some questions later. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think your point, I brought up the point that grantees really appreciate unrestricted funds because it lets them set their agenda. But I think I can certainly say that our largest single grant was exactly what you said, an investment in a center of excellence with Atlantic at UWC to build a life sciences center. So it can go both ways. And hearing that there's been interest in Fort Hare, that's exactly the kind of thing that helps to distinguish a university. We're going to slightly shift who's speaking next because of some internet connectivity issues. And by the way, the person who's going to be speaking, Ahmed Bawa, is not in South Africa. He's in Ireland having these issues. But we're going to have Ahmed Bawa follow next, the head of USAF. Ahmed?
Thank you so much, Bill. And I want to thank
Ahmed, we're having trouble hearing you. I think what we're going to do, if it's all right, can you see if you can get a slightly better connection, and we will shift over to Sibusiso Moyo, the DVC research at your former institution, DUT. And we'll see if we can't plug you in a little later.
Hey, Bill, it's Ferial. Perhaps what Ahmed can do is just switch off his video and try and just do audio. We may get a better reception. Can try that.
Ahmed, do you want to give it one chance?
Yeah, can you hear me now? Is that better? Is that better? No.
It's a little bit better. What I'll do is I will step in if it's not working well, but let's give it a try.
Okay, you can stop me if it's necessary, please. Okay, so first of all, let me just very quickly then say that, first of all, I really appreciate the work that Beverly and her team have done, and also, of course, the imagination of Inyathelo together with Kreski, of course, in embarking on studies of this kind. It's a completely
Ahmed, Ahmed, I think that the Irish, Ahmed.
So we really do need these studies, and in particular,
Ahmed, I think we're having trouble understanding
you. Data, which kind of gives us a sense of the trends, if you like. So I really want to say, yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry, Ahmed. I think the Irish internet system is not maybe as amazing as one would assume. So I'm gonna, if we can, we'll try again, but let's go ahead and see if we can get Sibusiso in.
Hear me? Okay, yeah. So I think that's fine. So thank you so much, and sorry to Ahmed. I'm surprised that I thought it could be Western Africa, but it's consoling to also know that Ireland can have network issue connections. So what I wanted to do quickly is just, to thank you for, giving me this opportunity to share a little bit about DUT. I thought that maybe the best way to do this would be to just, talk about a little bit about what has happened at DUT. I was asked to talk about the role of philanthropic support for universities in South Africa, looking at the DUT, case study. So what I wanted to do quickly was to say, for us as, universities of technology, I will not speak on behalf of all the universities of technology, but I can use DUT as a case study. Our major breakthrough was when we got the Kreski grant back in 2012. Of course, that made a big difference because it meant that we were able, and I must just state that it was during when Professor Bauer used to be our Vice Chancellor then, so he played a big role. So that helped us to create capacity within, our advancement office. So from then we were able to establish an office And I think in late 2018, when we had the new Vice Chancellor who came on board as well, we were able to make sure that these posts, the people who had received training in advancement work, they were exposed to a number of workshops. And I know Zwakele is, attending here with me. So we were able to then, motivate to the university that we could establish this. So I think that generally for, if I look at universities of technology, the whole idea of philanthropy and, the organizational structure and having, support within the university of people can focus on advancement work and also bring to the fore, the flagship programs that universities are involved in. Like we've just been talking about this idea of having centers of excellence and the niche areas which, donors can find interesting to invest in is important. And I think the one gap I can say is that when I just compare to traditional universities to, universities of technology, that's still an area which needs to grow, because often you find it's a one-man army. And I know that even the advancement office we have at DUT, sometimes I know we need more capacity in that area as well, to just build capacity in terms of the staff who help with fundraising. The other areas that, I know that as a standard, there are a set of activities we are involved in terms of the market research which needs to take place. I think that often what I've noticed is that a lot of the staff, they spend time doing routine things in terms of administration and, trying to, because of the capacity that's there, there's very little time that's spent on the actual research, looking out at what, what donors are out there, what donors are interested in. In our case, I've said that when I've looked at our data and the report itself, I do know that we need to increase our footprint in terms of international donations as well. We have local funding, to some extent, but of course the gap is very different when you compare with traditional universities. But I think the whole idea of cultivating these partnerships, spending time on that and not just doing routine things, and also, the usual recognition of donors and trying to bring them on board in terms of what is the strength that the university is doing. So if you look at the trend from 2017 to 2021, we did notice that, in 2019, we had a bit more than what we had targeted, but our target has remained quite low. And the reason for this is that when we do the projections and looking at the data, we know that with the big investment we had actually was from the Kresge grant, but in terms of the donations from, our alumni, that is still very low. But I know that the CITAs do invest quite a bit in terms of student placement. But one of the challenges we've had is that in our own curriculum, as universities of technology, I know for DUT, we have recurriculated, but I think to a greater extent, unfortunately, many of our engineering programs for now don't have that WIL component, work integrated learning component, which was a big funding pool for us, especially for the batch, we used to call them BTECs. That also has been phased out. So we've seen a drop a little bit in terms of the CITA funding itself. But generally, some of the challenges we find is that, there are quite a number of these legacy issues, and most of it, related mainly to the culture among loan giving amongst alumni. And that might explain well in the sense that most of our students, I think over 80% of those depend on the national scheme for loans, student financial aid. So a lot of them don't give. We are trying to change that culture. When I talk to alumni and even our convocation, because I know that, there are some who are doing well, but we're trying to build this culture of trying to get our alumni to, to be able to give. And then DUT went through a merger some time ago. So we have had this bias where I think people don't really identify with the new institutions. So we tried to, actually we've just launched in the last few weeks, the DUT Foundation, which is like trying to bring this identity where we can bring the people who used to be old Nata Technicon, old ML Sultan, so that they can sort of identify with the institution. So that is also something which we are still trying to build. The gap there is around, older alumni who are able to give. I mean, some of them are well established, but just trying to identify with a brand where the university is going. This, of course, the structural inequality, which has been mentioned in terms of research versus traditional universities. But I think also the idea that I noted that sometimes, you do get a lot of donations where you have important health research that you are doing, and sometimes medical schools, I think, which can make a big difference. So this idea of having centers of excellence which are focused on these critical issues that can also attract funding is important. The brand reputation, our university and maybe some universities in the region are also well known for student protests, and sometimes this does affect especially our local donors in terms of the way they see ourselves and their desire to contribute to some of the programs that we have. Institutional culture, and I think organizational structures and job families are also important to talk about, because when I look at most of my colleagues and also within the university and some of the universities of technology, a lot of time is spent on routine stuff without really having time to think and to be creative, which I think is important for philanthropic funding, because one needs to have time to cultivate these relationships, to come up with strategies which can attract more funding. So the opportunities, of course, for us, we think that if we look at COVID-19, because one of the things which would be interesting to understand is the impact of COVID-19. What happens, what is the impact of that on philanthropic funding? What opportunities does it bring? We know that, in fact, during 2020, 2021, a lot of the research publications increased because I think people had more time to sort of stay home without too much traveling. I don't know, for various reasons, but there are opportunities for research, and both in the hard sciences and also social sciences, just looking at the pandemic and the effects of that, which can also help us in terms of looking at what niche areas we can create to attract more funding. But I think also there's room for innovation. And the one area I wanted to raise was mainly the area around, looking at curricula which allows for time at university and time in industry or corporate sector, a cooperative model of some sort. Because I think that we've seen during COVID that you actually don't need to spend all your time in a classroom for all the 12 months of the year, just having lectures. You can combine, you can still learn effectively if you combine the lecture attendance with actual practical work. And maybe this type of curricula needs to change, and it may be that one looks at different types of models, or even these centers of excellence, which can also contribute to curricula, especially where you involve data analytics, dealing with real problems, engineering students working on real case studies, rather than just theoretical work based on textbook data. They can collect real data applied in their scenario as well. And then also, I think that, increased incentives for philanthropic funding. I know that currently there are tax rebates, but I guess, there's a question in the chat where somebody was asking that, do you think that the tax, rebate, has this contributed to growth in income? To some extent, it does contribute, but I believe that there could be more incentives which can encourage people to give. But largely, our model that we use for funding students has to be such that we encourage the students to build a culture of giving, where if they get, funded, there should be a way in which when they start making money to give back, even if it's a very low percentage, but just that culture of giving. So I think I'll stop there here on Bill, if it's okay with you. Then we can have discussions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moyo. That was terrific. And it's interesting you brought up the tax deductibility. That is an issue in the United States. Traditionally, of course, you could make a donation and get a tax deduction. In a recent tax law change in 2017, they removed that for most middle and working class and low income taxpayers. It was restored a little bit in COVID, but it makes me wonder, could South Africa have, for example, tax incentives for giving nationally for universities from their alumni? The alumni tend to be wealthier, tend to have more assets that they can give from, but maybe provide a better tax break for some of the HDIs or universities of technology. So you have an incentive maybe to give to institutions, even ones that you didn't attend, because there might be more of a tax break. I don't know, just throw that one out. I don't know if we have any government people on the line. I'm sure they're concerned about revenue. What we're going to do is Ahmed did step off the line for a while. So what we're going to do is, if everyone doesn't mind, we're going to shift over to Russell Alley and have Dr. Alley talk about his thoughts on the report.
Thanks, colleagues. I'm going to be very brief because I would really want those who join this discussion to participate. So a few observations. One is there's quite a strong correlation between the universities that do well in terms of the funding that they raise and the universities' rankings. It's not just a South African phenomenon, it's a universal phenomenon. So if you look at the 10 universities that were surveyed, and although it's an anonymous survey, I just want to make one or two comments about that in closing, about the anonymity of the survey, but it's an anonymous survey. But generally, we know the universities that we're talking about. And if you look at the universities, the 10 universities, and if we rank them, you'll find that there's a very strong correlation, as I said, between the where the universities are in terms of their funding and where they are in terms of their ranking, their national ranking, their ranking on the continent, Africa-wide, and also their ranking globally. So there's a lesson in that, and I think that it's very important that we always have to ensure that this strong link between whatever the strategy is of an advancement office and what the strategy is of the university. The more ambitious the university is in terms of where it wants to see itself in relation to its counterparts, that will also reflect quite well in terms of its the goals that it sets for itself when it comes to advancement. So that's the first point that I want to make. The second point is that although we do not have a strong culture of alumni giving, that doesn't mean that alumni giving is insignificant. My experience has been that it's not so much the quantity. Doesn't matter. It's not a question of how many alumni gives. It's a question of which alumni that are given and how much. And so there's an overlap actually with high net worth individuals tend to be alumni. So we should be focusing more. I think it's always important to focus on general alumni giving because it's important to profile the university and for alumni to be proud of the university. But it's also more important, I think, to target, to see, to identify illustrious alumni that have done well, that have become wealthy, and one should always try to ensure that one reaches out to those alumni. And if you look at some of the biggest gifts, if you look at the biggest gifts at Wits University, for example, over the last few years, you will see it is alumni giving, but high net worth alumni, and there's usually very targeted campaigns around high net worth individuals. So that's very, very important. The third observation that I want to make is that I think we at the stage now where we should be moving away from the survey being anonymous, because I think we are public institutions, we are publicly funded, and so I think that there should be a greater transparency. But I think it's also a much better way of us benchmarking rather than second guessing each other, and that competition, healthy competition, is not bad, but it is also good for us to be able to collaborate, because One can identify where the strengths are in one's peers, and there can be a community of practice. One can learn, and I don't see that there may have been a reason in the beginning because this was something new, novel. People may have had their concerns, but now that we've been doing it for 7-8 years, I think it's become quite common practice now. We should see where we are in relation to each other. And I mean, that also links back to the point that I had made earlier about rankings, that rankings it's a public exercise, and more and more universities are participating in rankings. So we shouldn't leave the rankings to the preserve of the so-called elite or the top performing universities, because I think the more that we can participate in rankings, and remember, rankings is not limited to just the ranking as an institution, holistically. You may be, so just to give an example, the University of Cape Town may be the top university in the country and the top university on the continent. It doesn't mean that it has the top business school in the country. So rankings is also can also relate to what's happening in faculties, can also relate to what's happening at schools. And so the more that we can profile what's really excellent about universities, our universities, and especially that comes through the ranking system, the more that helps us in terms of maximizing or leveraging opportunities for fundraising. So I think we need to move away from being anonymous, and we should have more and greater transparency. Then I think in order to really make sure that we are measuring like with like, Beverly mentioned earlier, when Beverly did the sort of statistical analysis and the comparative data, she distinguished from philanthropic giving and SETA giving. I think this creates unnecessary confusion. I think it makes it a little bit unnecessarily onerous as well for those who in our institutions, in our advancement offices, we have to compile the data. I think we should start speaking about this, not just about an annual survey in philanthropy. I think we should change the language a little bit, and we should call this an annual survey of giving in higher education. And philanthropy is one part of giving. In some cases, in some of our institutions, the philanthropy is not even the biggest component of giving. As is seen in terms of SETA giving. I don't really want us to consider SETA giving as philanthropy, but it is the third stream income. In other words, it's not fees and it's not the state subsidy. So if we use the language of giving, I think it captures that, encapsulates that a little better. It's a more accurate. And within giving, one can segment, and philanthropy could be one part of it. Public giving, individual giving, whatever kind of categories, as long as it's consistent across the board, so we are able to measure like with like. And then the last thing that I want to conclude really is what is really going to make a difference at our institutions, and what's going to help us in our advancement work is really understanding what is our comparative advantage. What are the unique distinguishing features of our institutions? What makes us stand out? And it can be because we're the top performing university in the country. It could be that we have the best medical school. Somebody mentioned now the University of the Fort Hare. Another thing about the University of Fort Hare that is not always known is it is one of the best agricultural schools, departments in the university higher education sector. The University of the Free State has its particular strengths. A strength that people really don't know much about is the medical school, for example, at the University of the Free State. Also the work that it does in I think it's the only university in the country that actually has not just one, but two observatories linked to the institution. Some other institutions may be strong in arts and culture. it's really what are these distinguishing features, and find those distinguishing features within the university and profile them and highlight them in the campaigns that one embark upon. So I'll stop there, Bill, and I'm sure that there are many questions or comments that people want to make. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Russell. That was great. So we have about a half hour left of what we're going to be doing. And what I'd like to do is, one thing is that we'd like to keep the questions sort of more high level. So on some of the technical things, we're going to maybe answer them separately, maybe in the chat. But one thing I was intrigued by, and I'd love to just sort of throw this out to anybody who'd like to answer. And I think if it doesn't affect your bandwidth, I would go ahead and ask Sarah, Sibusiso, and Russell, as well as Beverly, to turn on their video so we can see them. But a question I have, Sibo asked, what could be the reason for the increase in philanthropy post fees must fall? What I realize that you're sort of guessing, but what's your gut feeling as to why there was more money going to the sector from individual donors at post fees must fall? And maybe Sarah, I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you did say you surveyed your peers. So what do you think, what were they saying the justification was?
So I didn't ask them that question.
Sorry.
It's fine. Look, I've got a gut feeling about it, not based on anything scientific. My gut feeling is that it raised visibility of the issue of universities, of poor students, of students sleeping in libraries, of students going home without anything to eat. So I think it was a massively successful visibility campaign. Whatever we think about the methodologies and other things, I think it really raised visibility for starters. And I think, and especially if maybe we want to talk about the private sector, my sense is the private sector are deeply concerned and vested in the universities. This is where they get their new employees. They need to know that there is a pipeline of young graduates who are employable. And I think there was a great sense of fear that the universities were not coping with the level of turbulence and disruption that kind of campaign was provoking. So I think it was a combination of visibility and fear, if I can summarize it that way.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else have any thoughts about why we saw so much giving?
Maybe just to elaborate a little bit on what Sarah said. I mean, historically, the corporate sector is the funding that the corporate sector has provided to the university over the years. Historically, had been bursaries and scholarships. That was the predominant form of support. And very often it used to go through the HR departments, human resources. As Sarah mentioned, a lot of it is also tied to recruitment strategies. Mm-hmm. I think that what Fees Must Fall did really was to show just the fragility of our institutions, and the fact that our institutions are not going to survive if they are totally and solely dependent on state funding. That these are public institutions. And so I think what has happened in the corporate sector, there's been a diversification. So it's not just about bursaries, it's seen universities as public good, as public assets, that they're important not just for employment or recruitment, but also for our society, our democracy, social cohesion. Of course, there's always a bottom line. This is what you see, there's self-interest. and that was certainly at play. But what is also interesting, what's actually happening now, and I'm sure we're going to see more of this. I'm sure Ahmed knows a lot more about this. It's a pity that we have the connectivity problems with Ahmed Bauer, who's the Chief Executive Officer, as we said, of USAF, University of South Africa, where all the vice chancellors of our universities, the 26 vice chancellors of our universities, that's the forum. The higher education department is at the moment looking on behalf of the state looking at the funding formula or the funding models for higher education, and they're realizing that the state funding through the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, NSFAS, is not going to be able to meet the needs, and we've seen that. So at the heart of a lot of the fees must fall was the crisis of NSFAS, actually, and the issue of what's referred to as the missing middle. In other words, those who fall outside of what the state subsidy provides, but where the families don't have enough money to pay, where normally private tuition or private fees. So the new funding that has been explored now is really looking at public-private partnerships and other ways in which to generate income to ensure the sustainability of the universities. So there has been a sea change, I think. The fees must fall has been a game changer, not just in the way in which the politics is conducted at our universities, but also the way in which the funding of our universities has been looked at. So I think those are some of the factors that have contributed to. And if you look at where the higher education falls now, there's still a HR component, but you'll see that a lot of the corporate social investment focus or included in the corporate social investment focus areas is higher education, whereas before that was not necessarily a focus area. It would be somewhere else.
I'm curious for everybody. One question I have, I just looked up this list of the top 6 ranking universities, the top 13, but you can see which are the top 6. And I'm not going to judge whether it's the right or wrong list. It is a list. But the question I have is, it does seem as though most of the institutions that are highly ranked are also urban. They're in Johannesburg, they're in Cape Town, they're in Pretoria, they're in fact, in the top 13, they're in PE. And I just wonder, do you think that is also part of the challenge for some of the HDIs? They were created by the apartheid government to, every homeland had an airport, a parliament, a university, and a capital, right? And these were often in rural areas. Do you think that is a challenge, that it makes it hard to retain and keep advancement staff? And also it's hard to get there when you're trying to court and cultivate gifts. What do people think?
Don't tell Stellenbosch that it's in a city. It's a rural university. It's one of the top universities in the country.
But I see a lot of very nice
There's
condos.
always an exception to all.
Yeah, there are very nice condos and restaurants. You can still get to the Baxter Theater. And I just wonder if there's an issue there. I just think about traveling long distances to Alice, or even going to the Peter Maritzburg campus, pretty distant from the center of the city for UKZN. What do people think? Is that part of the challenge? Is that, would that help? And Rita, what do people think?
Maybe I should say something about that as well. I think that, maybe one of the things which we need to also pay attention to is the geographical location of institutions is important, but what is important is what happens in that area in terms of the ecosystem when you bring together the university, community, your health services, police services, the business sector in that area. because I think that if you look at the type of students, for example, who would go, let's say UCT, Stellenbosch, the student life is important, and the experience that students have when they leave the university. And I know as a parent, I mean, you worry about, you know, when you have your kids, wherever they are, whichever university, whether it's UP or wherever, the student experience facilities, the accommodation, and when they complete, the idea that they can still go back and also, you know, give to that university as alumni depends a lot on that experience. So we maybe must not underestimate the role that the location and also the environment, what that role can play in terms of student life, and also, you know, just developing these, because I believe that students become friends of the university. They actually become our key stakeholders later on. So I think we mustn't underestimate that role. Rankings do play a big role in terms of understanding what the university is good at. You know, we know that, yes, you can get ranked, but it depends also what area you're good at. So I think that rankings are also important just for visibility, especially if you've never been to the area and you don't know anything about that institution. So I think what somebody said earlier, I think it was one of the panelists as well, around showcasing, you know, what we are good at as institutions is important to also, you know, take into account. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Rita Longa. Will the COVID pandemic have a long-term impact, both in terms of innovation at universities and in fundraising? What do people think? Do they think that, like the Feastman's Fall, that there's been a shift?
Well, Calvin has raised his hand.
Thank you. Does anybody have a thought about, and we'll get to Calvin next, but does anybody have a thought about whether COVID is going to affect advancement in fundraising?
Look, I mean, it's unavoidable because the impact of COVID, first of all, has been on the economy, okay? And philanthropy or giving. There's always a link between giving or philanthropy and the state of the economy. Sometimes there's a lag. I mean, it's not always immediate. But we are seeing it now. Many corporates have already indicated that they've had to cut their budgets, their CSI budgets, because of these the performance of their companies. Of course, there is a provision, as you know, in the legislation that a certain percentage of profits after net that has to be dedicated to corporate social investment. So, of course, with profits having declined, and that means that a smaller percentage then is going towards the CSI budget. So that's the general trend, and whether and how long it takes for the economy to recover, of course, that we don't know. The most recent shock, of course, to the world economy has been what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, and the way that has affected commodity prices, particularly oil. And so we've seen how that has also had an impact. But if we're asking, I think the question is more specific, is a change in the way. So the impact of, obviously, of COVID on the quantity of giving, that's a given, right? We understand that. But I think the question is more, are there qualitative shifts? Are we seeing the way in which is philanthropy shifting or giving changing in terms of what the way COVID has changed society? That's a more complex question, and it's a very interesting question. Yes, I think certainly. I think there's a lot more focus on the issues like we're speaking about now, about connectivity, about technology, use of technology, use of media, social media, where funding is going. That's certainly a factor. Our student, the way in which we teach, the way in which we learn, the way in which we do research, all of those sort of things. So yes, there's no, I think I don't think we can get away from it, that there are some qualitative shifts in thinking, in strategies, in portfolios, or focus areas, as it were. And our job in advancement offices is really to understand those trends and then to see how we can adapt as well, and the way in which we interact with the funders out there.
Thank you. Let's go to Calvin Maseko from CPUT. Calvin, what's your question?
Thank you, Bill Moses. In response to those two questions about the impact of COVID and also what urbanization or where are we based as universities? It is true that COVID has impacted how we get money. In the experience of CPUT, for example, we've got a huge knock. Why? Because companies and the government, they're talking about repurposing of their limited resources. And that's why we've got Lickly now. But also in South Africa, on a daily basis, we are either losing a company due to the impact of COVID. You know, people not getting business anymore. I mean, people are saying that most companies have got 30 to 50% drop in their turnover due to COVID. So we are also experiencing that problem, because when you look at how we are funded predominantly in terms of the BE Act, which says that 1% of income, net income after tax, can then go to CSI. And then, I mean, if 1%, then if 1% of less, we're still gonna get less, you know, because we are experiencing as an economy really a downturn. Also, the proximity to what you asked earlier, the proximity to urban areas. Of course, the more the university is at close proximity to the decision makers, whether that is where head offices corporates are, or corporates of head office of corporates are, or the government. In fact, if you look at, for example, University of Pretoria, we as universities are not competing with University of Pretoria when it comes to what do they call it, consultancy to train government officials and so forth, because they are closer to where the head offices of government departments are. They get huge money from that. So now you cannot therefore compare with a university based in Venda, you know, on its consultancy income, on its CSI income. That's a fact. And hence why when we speak about this thing of what a historic HDI, which I find it also very confusing, because for me, there's nothing called historical disadvantage, because if it was historical, then we shouldn't be talking about that today. We should be saying we're in a completely new South Africa. We are still disadvantaged today, and hence why the trend that used to be there pre-94, it is still the same trend today, because the economy has not made that shift. So yes, it is very true. Thank you.
Thanks, Calvin. Beverly, did you want to step in and add something?
Yeah, yes, I just 3 points, you know, the one is around the, you know, the legacy issue. I mean, I think, you know, we have to be clear and upfront that you're looking at about 8 institutions that have got very long established traditions of more than a century, having started out as colleges in the early days. And when you compare that to institutions that were birthed from the 1960s onwards, you can then see, you know, the kind of the difference in those traditions. So it might be useful to look at some of those universities that were started, that were birthed after the 1960s, such as the University of Port Elizabeth, that is now part of Nelson Mandela, and Rand Afrikaans University, that's part of UJ, and they constitute the comprehensive cluster. You know, how are they able to kind of to generate income? So I think that it's about long established traditions. So that's the first point. The second point is, I mean, I think that Russell makes an interesting, I mean, I think Russell's point about the fact that it would be important to to see centers of excellence within an institution rather than to recognize the institution in its entirety. And I think that that makes a lot of sense. The problem with that is that the system, the national research system, doesn't go that route at all. You see, it goes the route of the individual in the institution, unlike what is happening in the UK, where your research assessment is exactly what Russell's pointing to. So there might be some kind of conversation there around that. The third point about COVID, the question around COVID, I mean, I think that, you know, clearly there are kind of there's a fallout. But I think that there's also an opportunity. And the opportunity is that the giving is not only in monetary terms. You see, giving can also be in terms of talent. So for example, with the rising technology and the speed with which it's developing at the moment, there is the potential and possibility for online global programs in which one can then look at it collaboratively with global institutions to offer these programs as well. So I think that might also be, you know, an opportunity for running online global programs. And I think that there are examples of one or two that's happening at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, it is interesting because we haven't really heard much discussion about, say, UNISA. Many years ago, we looked at Kresge at the Open University in the UK, and you know they have a very different approach to how they assemble their curriculum. How they actually have experts not just in content, but also in visual display, so that everything they do, they're trying to make as compelling as possible in an online setting. And I know that many years ago, UNISA was still pretty committed to paper as a mode of instruction, partly because many of the students who took their courses were not easily accessible by the internet or electricity even. And so it is interesting, I think, to think about these possibilities. One question about or a comment about the rankings, Russell, is, in the United States recently, the rankings have gotten a lot of criticism, including from my employer, or my department, I should say, my employer. And one of them is that the rankings are often it's human beings choosing what is the most important factor to assess, one. And the other one is, in our case, in the US News rankings, is that they're using very subjective data. So not only are they subjective in what data they use, the data they get is subjective, that it's a survey of other universities that can game that. And there's been a lot of cheating. I think some of the other surveys may not be as prone to cheating, but one thing that's come up recently, and this may be an advantage to some institutions in South Africa, but I'd be curious to hear what people think, is looking increasingly at social mobility as a way to judge an institution. So for example, many of the top ranked American universities, the Ivy League institutions, the public flagships, they actually are not very good at social mobility. They take people from the highest quintile and they help keep them there. They don't take a lot of people from the lowest quintile and get them into the top quintile. And so I'm just curious what people think about Russell's idea that rankings are highly correlated with who gets money, and whether the rankings are necessarily the best way to be correlated.
Bill, I'll have a stab at trying to respond to some of these ideas. I think in South Africa, again, with our youth unemployment crisis as a focus and as a real area that I think through business, philanthropy, government, there's a common understanding that it is an absolute crisis when you have youth unemployment sitting at 65%. You know, for me, a ranking that correlated around employment would probably galvanize certainly the private sector very powerfully, and it would be an interesting analysis to do. You know, I think I kind of go back to my point that the rankings, yes, they may influence the funding, but let's not forget that the funding is primarily, in my view at least, influenced by student preference. So it's the students who are interested in the rankings. It's the students who are interested in the prestige universities. And a lot, at least 50% of the funding are following the student preferences. So my argument would be, let's work more in a more directed and explicit way to first understanding why those student preferences are as they are, and whether we can't broaden their horizons. Because I think a lot of that student preference could be much better informed, could be, you know, I think they're not necessarily making their best choices because those 6 universities that you chose, you know, that you showed in that ranking are the top 6 universities. And they just go, oh, well, if we get one of those 6, life is going to be good. But actually, they could be making much more nuanced decisions about studying locally, studying at centers of excellence in areas where there are strong ties to local business, to local job opportunities, to growth sectors, growth industries. So for me, it's less about persuading the money than persuading the students.
Sarah, that's a really interesting point. And I think we've seen in the United States a similar issue of students choosing institutions without being fully informed about what their options really are, and that thinking, well, it's number 4, so it's better than number 6, because they think that this ranking has been assayed like some sort of nuclear test or something that's determined exactly how many, you know, atoms there are in the institution, and there are more, and that they may be making badly informed decisions.
Absolutely.
If they were living at home and they didn't have to pay for, especially for, say, the missing middle, and didn't have to pay for residence halls, they might not have as much debt, and, you know, they may not have quite the experience they were hoping for, but they might actually finish, as opposed to dropping out early because of a job loss or something. And I think, you know, we've seen we think a lot of improvements in attainment in the United States because of better advising in high schools, so that students are making the right choice from the get-go, rather than purely just saying, you know, Googling best colleges, best universities in South Africa and saying, well, I got into number 7, so that's what I'm going to.
Absolutely. And I mean, you know, as possibly a trite example, you know, and I am a social science student, so I totally believe in the social sciences, but if you, it doesn't equate that if you've got an undergraduate social science degree from UJ, that you are going to have a better chance of getting a great job than if you've got a more technical degree or diploma from a TVET college in your more local, you know, university or higher education. In fact, the chances of you getting a job are probably a lot higher. So I think it's often, you know, the preference is often determined just at a holistic university name level, without really dipping further down to department or school level, where the opportunities, you know, really are for particular, you know, a particular match. So I'm in agreement with you.
Thank you. Sibusiso, you had your hand up a second ago. I don't know if you still have a comment you'd like to make.
No. I think that, I think what I wanted to say has already been covered. It was around rankings and so forth. So I think, yeah, I shouldn't repeat myself. So I was just going to say that, that all these rankings, there are different types of rankings and, which look at different perspectives. Recently, there's been the impact rankings, which have been introduced, which probably make more sense in terms of trying to look at how the work that the university does and the impact on the sustainable development goals. But I think that we shouldn't preoccupy ourselves, I think especially in the African context, so much with the rankings. They are important, yes, for visibility, but I think that they shouldn't be the primary sort of focus because we have quite a lot of serious problems we're supposed to look at. The unemployability level is quite high amongst our graduates, but also I think the curriculum is almost like we just inherited the curriculum and have done very little to change it from the time that these curricula were established. I still think there's room for innovation in terms of the curriculum and how it's offered to create more work streams for students and skills which students can use in developing their own enterprises as well in the long run. So yeah. So I shouldn't say more than that. I think most of the things have been said already. Thank you.
Thank you. So Calvin, it looks, go ahead, Beverly.
No, I just wanted to make a point around ranking. I mean, I also don't think that, I think we have to, kind of problematize ranking because ranking sees higher education as a marketplace. And in some ways, the philanthropic market has made a decision as to where it wants to invest. So I'm wondering whether, we can't, is there not a kind of middle ground, that can complement not, this notion of higher education as a market? Because, in as much as we talk about the student's life chances are determined by other variables. And so, yeah, I think we need to consider it, more holistically, not only as a highly competitive market.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I don't know, just a point.
Calvin, it looks like you have the final question.
Thank you.
What would you like to ask?
Thank you, Bill. You see, I agree with you when you say that the ranking, whether perceived or whether subjective or objective, it's got an impact on how we raise funds. But I also agree with Sarah when she says people's preference has got an impact. But maybe where I may differ with her a little bit is on the impact of where did you get the qualification and how you are treated by industry. Let me give an example. On Monday, we had an industry meeting. The Vice Chancellor and Executive had an industry meeting on Monday. Alumni were there. It was a big event because we had to do it because of just wanted to share experience with industry. One of the alumni, they said, whenever we go to industry and then we're supposed to be paid, we are paid less coming from a UOT than it is from a traditional university. And then it was a common understanding that that's a big problem. Interestingly, one national research company in the country even confessed and said, yes, we are very sorry, that is what we've been doing, CPUT. We've been paying your graduates less than from other institutions, and we have discovered that, and then we have now fixed that problem. So indeed, how we perceive the university, and I also have got my own experience as a fundraiser as well. There's one company which I had to ask them, why do you have only 2 students that you're funding from CPUT and then the others from a lot of students from these universities? They said to me, ours is an award based on how you performed at matric. So if you as a student decide to go and study at UCT or Stellenbosch, whatever, then we'll follow you with our money. So your choice of the university determines where do we take our money. So yes, how the public perceives us is also reflects on how on our ability to get money, which therefore calls for us to market ourselves, sell the selling points that you said. This university is very unique in this. Probably, maybe we are going to get a better deal going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you know, it's been really interesting, I think, because we've talked about the sort of the specifics of how do you make advancement work, what the trends are, where the funds are coming. I see positive things when I see more and more local donors supporting higher education, because we knew that international donors were pulling back over time. And so to see that replaced is excellent. We still see this gap between some of the oldest, most urban, and traditionally most asset-rich institutions, and some of the newer, more rural and historically disadvantaged institutions. Historically, maybe they shouldn't be disadvantaged in the last 25 years, but they historically had been disadvantaged. And I think that it's interesting to think about that. And we've heard some interesting ideas from Russell and from Beverly, whether it's changing the name of the survey, making it not anonymous, thinking about what makes an institution stand out. What is within our control as advancement professionals and higher education leaders, as philanthropists, and what is beyond our control? And I do think that we have a lot of ways in which we could think about improving the survey, and also thinking about how we make sure that that the institutions that have been lagging have all the skills and technical abilities to perform at their very best, even despite maybe some biases built into the broader higher education market. But I'm going to turn this over to Nazima to close us out. And I just want to thank everybody for participating.
Oh, thanks, Bill, and thanks to all the panelists. This was an incredible conversation, and also to people who contributed to the chat and to the participants who managed to get their voices heard. The thing that Calvin said as one of our advancement directors, how the public perceives us and impacts on our ability to receive money is a critical statement. And I think the whole intention of this roundtable was to start unpacking perceptions and whether there are biases in the system. And I think, Sarah's contribution has greatly enriched our thinking around how philanthropy is thinking about the university system, but broader than that, thinking about the higher education system, because she has mentioned the TVETs as an important component. I do believe that COVID, and we know someone asked the question that how has COVID impacted? I think we're still going to see the devastating impact of COVID with the impact that it's had on the further education and training system. It's knocked out so many promising young people who would have probably entered into university from the system. And I think it's something that we need to give a great deal of thought to. I like Bill's proposal around incentives, for funding the other, the comprehensives, the universities of technology, and the 8 HDIs that are still classified as such by government in the system. Is really a pity that we didn't get to hear from Professor Ahmed Bawa today. He would have brought in, greater sense of what's happening in the national system and how the vice chancellors in particular are thinking about where the system is going. But I think we could possibly, if he's open to it, do an interview with him and then post it as an addition to this webinar on our website. But all in all, you have all been wonderful. And I really appreciate, that people have registered and spent the afternoon with us, and especially to the panelists and to you, Bill, for being here and making this substantive contribution to the conversation. And I hope it's the beginning of a conversation that we can take much further. ASPIHE continues, and we will be in touch with the advancement directors shortly. And thank you so much, everyone, for your participation. And to all the Inyathelo staff for the work that you've put into the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nazima.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye so much.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.